All right, Tim, thank you for being on the show with us today.
My pleasure, Sam. Good to be with you.
Yeah, so it's funny. I need to set some background here why we're having this conversation. My friend and mentor, Paul Vogelzang, who, as of recording, we just spoke earlier today,
Yeah.
he has been a huge inspiration to me running his Not Old Better show, and he's been mentoring me for years and years. And he finally gave me the push I needed to begin my own podcast, and here we are.
Okay.
And as luck would have it, I was always thinking about ways of how can I work closer with Paul. I know that he serves people who are 55 plus and in all sorts of ways. And wouldn't you know, I find Tim Elmore talking to Carrie Newhoff, and I just eat up everything you're saying about age diversity and all these
Yeah.
things we can learn and gain from having a more generationally aware perspective at work and in life. And
Yeah.
so I just knew I had to talk to Tim, and here we are. And I have your book, A New Kind of Diversity,
Yeah.
which has been fantastic. But to start things off, I want to ask, what is that new kind of diversity, and where did this research come from for you?
Yeah. Good question. I think the best way to answer that most accurately would be to say, as I look around the landscape of corporate America and really beyond business, we are talking lots and lots and lots about diversity, right? We talk about gender diversity, and that's a thing, ethnic diversity for sure, income diversity. It goes on and on and on. And those are important conversations. But I think we're not having as helpful conversations about generational diversity.
Mm.
There is a very real distinctive demographic filling the workplaces today that may be up to 4 or 5 generations trying to work together. So you got somebody that like Paul that's 66 or 62 or whatever. And then
Hmm.
you've got the recent grad that's just joined the team, but may have never had a full-time job before, all through school. And, those different experiences can cause frustration naturally when we don't really work or think hard about it, but they can cause fascination when we realize, oh my gosh, something new and good and helpful has just been added to our team. Let's capitalize on it rather than
Hmm.
just beating the same drum of those 55 and older. So I did the book not because I'm the grand guru on the subject, although I will say I've been studying now for just over 30 years. So about your lifetime, Sam.
Yeah.
Over, when the Xers were coming through, when I started my career, the boomers were coming through. And then it was the millennials, and it was the Gen Zers. And now the alpha generation are the
Mm.
younger kids that are not yet in their career, but they're coming up. And they've never known a day without a tablet. Even at 4 years old, they were on a tablet. So I thought I better help leaders as best I can have an encyclopedia in their hand to refer to chapter 7 or chapter 4 when they need to read up how do I connect with those 25-year-olds or whatever. So I'll
Mm.
stop there, but that's what drove me to try to create something that would be a resource for this
Right.
need.
And so when we're talking about generations, I think there are so many layers to this because we can
Yeah.
talk about generations, we can talk about life stage, which
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
stretching and doing different things depending on the generation. But for me, I find it so interesting to discuss it in terms of at least this one idea of these historical reference points. Because for
Yes.
me, I've heard that millennials are distinguished from Gen Z,
Yeah.
for instance, by we remember what pre 9/11 was like
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
Americans at least, and maybe in a lesser extent globally. And Gen Z, they really don't remember a time without smartphones.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
thinking it backwards for me, I thought the Berlin Wall, Chernobyl, I had no idea, no context for that.
That's right. It's all
And
history. Yeah.
yeah, it's all history. I mean, Chernobyl, let alone JFK, right? So
Yeah.
all these things that older people lived through. But for me, it makes no sense. I didn't have that experience to gain that wisdom. I think these
Yeah.
are interesting ideas to place ourselves in context.
I think it is. In one survey, Gen Z put the Columbine High School massacre in the same category as JFK's assassination.
Huh.
And we're going, oh
Wow.
my gosh, totally different pieces of history. But for them, it's all the past.
Right.
So you did bring up something interesting, Sam, that I want to double click on. There is such a thing as ageism and chronocentrism. And here's what that means. So you're right. Some might argue, well, when you're past 40, you just think what all generations have thought past 40, whether you're
Mm,
born in 1930 or 1980 or 2010. It's not completely true. Certainly, as you get older, you get a little more tired, you get a little more stuck in your ways. There's no
mm,
doubt about it. But based on what was happening in your formative years, the first 2 decades of your life, we're like wet cement. Our brains develop a little bit like wet cement. I don't know about you, Sam, but I remember when I was 9 years old, my friend Steve and I went outside in our neighborhood, and there was a fresh patch of wet cement on a sidewalk that we thought, OMG, this is awesome. We put our
mm.
handprints in that wet cement. And then Steve thought, let's sign it. Like that was a brilliant
Ah,
idea. So we
right, of
signed
course.
it like goofballs, not knowing we just indelibly etched the criminal act and who did it.
Right.
Bottom line is, we went out even a day or two later. We could not fix the problem because it had begun to harden.
Mm,
So our neural pathways in our brain, not in 2 days, but in 20 to 25 years, aren't quite as plastic as they were when we were younger. So
mm,
we're mostly adaptable in the first quarter century of our life. After that, we're less adaptable. We have to work harder at changing. Just like you need a jackhammer to change a 1-year-old sidewalk,
sure.
you need a jackhammer to change our brains. Now, I'm being silly, but you get the point. So, as I look at how each generation was formed, the builder generation that was born 1929 and 1945, they were shaped by the Great Depression. They were shaped by World War II. My mom and dad were frugal and conservative and grateful because of the days that they were raised in. And then the baby boomers come along. 1946 to 64, there was a boom of babies between the end of World War II, when the soldiers came home, and the introduction of the contraceptive or the birth control pill. That was a big deal. And
Mm,
then Xers, that's a little bit younger than Paul and I, but the Xers were born 65 to 80, 82. Think about it, Sam. Those were more challenging times. The Vietnam War was going on, and
mm,
it was very mixed in its reviews. The Watergate scandal. Oh my
mm.
gosh. Now we had problems with a Democrat in office and a Republican in office. It was not good. The OPEC gas crisis. I remember as a teenager waiting in line for 2 hours to get gas. We
Wow.
thought we're going to run out of gas. But you can see how that would shape us. So X was a little more jaded, a little more cynical by and large. And then the millennials came along, your generation. It was a bit of time of expansion again. We can take on the world. We can change the world by noon on Friday, that sort of thing. Now I'm over speaking, but your generation was a little more idealistic, a little more confident. And then Gen Z, oh my gosh, Sam, I've loved sitting down with middle school, high school, college, and young professionals that were like 22, 23 years old. They were all so respectful, but every one of them were honest. And if I were to put in a phrase their paradigm entering the workforce now, it would be, I'm coping and hoping,
Mm,
coping and
wow.
hoping. So I'm hopeful because I'm young, but I'm just coping right now. I've got mental health issues right now. And my coping may not be coping skills. We all need coping
Mm,
skills, yeah, but we all have tough days. It may be coping mechanisms. I
mm.
have to binge on video games for 6 hours. It's the only way I can make it through the day. Now, I don't mean to stereotype, but I do mean to understand. It's helpful that when we hire that 22-year-old, they may have come from a very different world. And I think it's best to lead with a little empathy before we build the grit in their lives.
Now, I find this also interesting because as I've had this discussion with others, it's become very clear that we need to set some parameters, some boundaries around the conversation. It can be so easy for an audience to wave their hands and
Yeah,
say, "Look, we're all individuals,
yeah,
and
yeah.
let's not paint with too broad a brush." But
Rush. Right, right.
let's extend that metaphor perhaps and say, "Look, if you're painting the picture of who someone is, you're going to set some background tones. There's going to be some fundamental things that color how somebody shows up at work
Yeah,
and in their life. And so it's important to understand
yeah,
why we might be thinking differently from
yeah,
each other when we both think that we're just doing what any common
yeah,
sense person would do. And
yeah,
we end up doing different things and butting
yeah.
heads.
You just said it brilliantly. But all generations feel like they got the common sense angle. Why don't other people see the thing the way I do? But you bring up another great point, Sam. you're right. We might just say, aren't we all people? Aren't we all humans? Some are younger, some are older, but we are. Let me hasten to add this. We're not talking about psychology. We're talking about sociology. So
Mm,
psychology would underscore the fact that we all have different personalities. Some are pessimists, some are optimists, some are introverts, some are extroverts. In every generation, we have differences. Sociology, though, would be more about the narrative of a demographic of a generation, and there are similarities. So you and my kids in your 30s would
mm,
have a little bit different angle having grown up in the times that you're in. And then I also would point out social scientists tell us that if you're 5 years at the tail end of a generation or 5 years at the beginning of another, you're going to adopt characteristics from both. Uh,
mm.
5 years, you're what they call a tweener, you know.
Okay.
So you're kind of in between. I would be that between baby boomers and Gen Xers. I'm kind of a
Mm,
tweener. I have some boomer characteristics, some Xers, and then if you were born, let's say, in 1980, you might be called an Xennial. You're part Gen X,
yeah.
part millennial. And others might be Zillennial, tail end of millennials, first end of Gen Z. Zillennials are kind of that 1998 to 2004.
Mm,
I could go either way. So I don't know if that's helpful, but it's helpful for me to know I need to be talking in pencil, not pen. You know what I mean? But I also need to understand the person in front of me a little bit better and play chess, not checkers. I think we talked about that. Playing chess means I recognize there's different pieces in front of me: bishops, queens, rooks, knights. In checkers, all my pieces look alike. They all move alike. So I treat them all alike. I think it's better to
mm,
play chess with our people rather than checkers.
yeah. Well, I think I like the idea of writing in pencil instead of
Yeah,
pen.
yeah, that's
And
right.
also, let's be research focused here for a minute because
Yeah.
we can be using these brilliant, impactful, meaningful metaphors, but let's back it up with really what is making us different and what can we be doing about it? What has the research shown?
Yeah. Well, we did touch on this in our other
Mm,
conversation, but one of the comments I made, I'd love to kind of expand on because I think it helps answer this question. There was a much more sense of community 50 to 60 years ago because we didn't have our own niche on a smart
mm,
device. There was no smart device. So I mentioned, if you remember this, we had one screen in our house, just one, and it was a
mm.
black and white TV in 1963 or whatever. And
Wow.
so all of us gathered around the TV and watched one of three shows: ABC, NBC, or CBS. So we'd watch the show together, laugh together, talk about it together. We were together, even though it was mom and dad, sibling, my sisters, Uncle Bob, whatever. Fast forward, we've gotten divided, haven't we?
Mm,
We've got little niches. I bet you're on different platforms that I'm on, because you're
right.
30 years younger than me. So I need to value that and say, my God, Sam, I could probably learn a ton from you right now. And maybe I might have a nugget or two from the 44 years in my career that I have. So that's, I think, a very helpful way to look at it. We check our egos and our logos at the door, and we just
Mm,
say, let's learn from each other. That's what we need to do, is be lifelong learners going into the future.
yeah. It's funny you mentioned that because now the difference between me being 29 and me being 30 is that suddenly I do start feeling way more out of touch with my younger siblings
Yeah.
and their
Yeah.
cohort, using different apps and what's Be
Yeah.
Real. I mean, you should ask some of your Gen Z
Yes.
people about Be Real
Yep.
because it's just different. Only old people are on Facebook anymore. All these
That's
sorts
right.
of choices that we make and just end up happening.
It's so
As
true.
a student of psychology myself, it's been interesting to read and hear about how those who are doing the research, it would seem, at least those I've read, they are very focused on these crucial points, these inflection points in our lives. And for them, a lot of it has to do with their most recent one, which would have been a midlife or
Yeah.
the death of a spouse, something like
Yes.
that. Something I'm yet to get to. And
Yeah.
so,
Right.
for me, in my perspective, in trying to be curious and look ahead, perhaps try to glean some of that knowledge from people who are a little ahead of me in life, it makes me wonder what else can we, excuse me, what else can we be doing as younger generations, millennials and Gen Z,
Yeah.
to engage with the older generations in a
Yeah.
mentoring context?
Yeah, great question. So I would go back to some really fascinating research by Dr. Raymond Cattell 50 years ago in the early 70s. He did this research, published it, but I think we've forgotten it because we're 5 decades later.
Hmm.
He tells us that our brain changes over our lifetime. Not fundamentally, but here's what he says. He says, in the first portion of our life, we experience fluid intelligence. And in the second portion of life, we experience crystallized intelligence.
Hmm.
Here's the difference. And by the way, you have a little of both all through your life, but you have
Hmm.
mostly fluid. You would be in mostly your fluid intelligence years. Okay. I'd be mostly in my crystallized intelligence. So fluid intelligence specializes in innovation, adaptation. You're very nimble. You're learning language quicker than a 60-year-old does, that sort of thing.
Hmm.
And I think the companies that have been around a while say, we need to welcome these millennials and Gen Zers because they're going to have the intuition on where culture's going. You know, Once you get to the second half, it's crystallized intelligence, where really you specialize in summarization, clarification.
Hmm.
It's why maybe older professors at a university get high marks because they've been around so while. They know how to bottom line the issue. Here's what's important for the exam,
Right.
that sort of thing.
Right.
So I imagine a workplace where crystallized brains and fluid intelligent brains get together. Maybe someone like Paul is pouring into you saying, let me share some timeless nuggets you're
Hmm.
going to need. Work ethic, punctuality. I don't know what it is, but those kinds of things that grandma and grandpa taught us. There are some timeless virtues and values we need that will never go away. But then we're listening to you saying, tell us what you see coming, what's coming down the pike or the
Hmm.
pipeline, and we welcome you in the leadership team meeting. So you know what we've done, Sam? We've invited some of our younger team members into our leadership team meeting just to listen in and then chime in when they say, have you guys thought about using TikTok or blah blah blah?
Hmm.
No, say more about that. And it's been so fun when we allow perhaps a 23-year-old team member to be at the table. Yeah.
Yeah. See, and again, as I've studied psychology and seen what does it take to live a good life and to be a good influence on others, I think about how there is this work. You could say it's the work of the wise man or woman, the sage, what have you,
Yeah.
where
Yeah.
it's taking that wisdom and then recontextualizing it for a
Yeah.
new age,
Yes.
and that
Yes.
takes work. It takes
It
a
does.
lot of rethinking things perhaps and engaging with those of that younger generation
Yeah.
to see what works and what doesn't anymore.
That's exactly right. In fact, do you remember in our other conversation, I talked about the fact that we use images and metaphors to teach
Mm,
timeless leadership concepts? So one of ours is called bottled water. Bottled water.
okay.
So listeners, you can't see me probably, but I'm holding a bottle of water in my hand. Here's what I believe. Relevant leaders use what is cultural to say what is timeless.
Ooh.
Relevant leaders use what is cultural to say what is timeless. So here's where bottled water comes in. This bottle of water is a picture of both the cultural and the timeless. Okay. The water
Mm,
inside this bottle is timeless. Civilizations all down through history, wherever you live, you needed water. Okay. Ancient
mm,
China, ancient Egypt. The container we poured from, well, this is a 2023 cultural,
mm.
Atlanta, Georgia model that I've got in my head, right?
Right.
Ancient Egypt did not pour from a container that looked like this. So what do we keep changing? We keep changing the container to get the water to the people. That's what leaders need to do that are perhaps over 40 years old. Are you willing
Mm,
to change your container to get the water to those young team members that need to learn perhaps work ethic or discipline or honesty? I'll always hire an honest employee over a dishonest one every day. I don't care if it's
mm.
2050, 2023. So I don't know. I'm waxing eloquent now, but I
Yeah.
feel like the bottled water, whenever I look at it, it reminds me use what is cultural, a world they already understand, to say what is timeless, a world they may not yet understand.
Mm. I love that. And to flesh this out some more, one thing I've noticed is that these things, it's fun to talk about, and it's even funner. It's even
Yeah.
better when we can live it. But for those who are wanting to practice this type of awareness, these
Yeah.
competencies around generational diversity, it can be perhaps discouraging to get
Yeah.
started and then make one wrong step. Oh, conversation didn't go the way I
Yeah.
was hoping.
Yeah.
But I see it as a practice. It's something to grow into. And
Yeah.
I'm curious about your take on perhaps these tensions that can arise as we try to have these conversations between what's new, what's going on, what's relevant, and
Yeah.
what's timeless. We're going to butt heads on who takes precedent, who takes the lead when. So what
Yes.
does it
Yeah.
mean to be flexible without
Wow.
giving in?
Yeah, great question. So I actually do have a chapter in the book on that very topic because that hiring manager may interview a 22-year-old and they are very different. In fact, do you mind? I just want to share a couple of quick stories that I
Yeah.
put in the book that are just kind of fun because they're illustrating, oh my gosh, I need to connect here. So a friend of mine was interviewing a young, freshly minted college graduate, early 20s. And this young man was getting a tour of the office because she, the hiring manager, planned on hiring him.
Hmm.
So while they're walking to the office, I'm not kidding, he looked at her and straight face said, "When's spring break?" And she went, "Oh, we don't have spring break. We work all year round here. This is a 20, this, we work all year round." And he was troubled. And he goes, You you mean, well, how long do you work each day? And she goes, "Well, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week." And he said to her, "I'm just not an 8 hour a day sort of guy."
Oh,
I know. And I thought, oh boy. Of course, I'm thinking to myself, if you want to, eat and live indoors, you may want to look
yeah,
to 8 hours
you
a
could
day.
learn.
Now, I don't mean to throw any 20 something under the bus, but oh my gosh, there's a little bit to learn for them
Hmm.
because they've been in a classroom, not a workroom. But then, by the same token, that 22-year-old probably brings some great intuition. So here's the chapter on the preferences, intentions, and so forth. I believe we need to be stubborn on what our core is, meaning the core
Hmm.
values, the core fundamental building blocks we built this mission about, and not be flexible there. Know your
Hmm.
core and do not be flexible. In fact, this is a paradox of leadership. Good leaders are stubborn and open minded, both. You're
Hmm.
stubborn on your core, you're open minded on about everything else. So when we start hiring Generation Z in their 20s on our team, we're going to notice that we need to navigate between preferences, expectations, and demands.
Hmm.
Here's the difference. Preferences are, well, it's just what it means. I don't demand that this happen, but if I had my way, I would prefer the workplace to be like this. Very flexible, let me work from home, whatever. But we need to establish, are those preferences? Or are you making a demand? Because if that's a demand, I better say goodbye right now. We can't do that
Right.
here, right?
Right.
Expectations are a little bit stronger. And I'm telling you, Gen Z brings some expectations with
Hmm.
them. They're very socially active. They may want to know, does this company do anything for the community? Is it against, is it doing anything about climate change, for instance? Because that's the number one social issue on their mind. Just be ready. That might be an expectation. Demands are obviously the strongest. And I think it's important in the job interview right away, this is my opinion, to go ahead and get those out on the table. You both may be a little reticent to be honest and candid, but you
Hmm.
better do it in the first interview rather than get 5 interviews down and then go, oh, darn, I was hoping you were going to work out, but you're not going to work out. And say goodbye early and get on to somebody that will fit the culture. So I do tell a story, Sam, if you don't mind me elaborating.
Yeah.
In the book on that chapter on being flexible without giving in, I talk about Maggie and Antonio. Here's the bottom line. Maggie was a hiring manager at a very, very successful quick service restaurant um,
Hmm.
company. And so she's interviewing Antonio. And during the interview, he's got some experience. He seems to be very helpful. He's about 25, 26 years old. And so Maggie decides to go forward and share the core values, share the policies. Antonio agrees. He gets hired. Fast forward 3 or 4 weeks. Maggie, the hiring manager, and Antonio are on the same shift, and she sees this gigantic tattoo on his right arm.
Hmm.
Now, not a crime, but Maggie had just shared their policy that they don't want to be off putting to some of the older customers. So they don't want tattoos showing, when you're at the cash register. Now,
Sure.
whether the listeners are agreeing or not, that was a policy. So Maggie's a little upset. First and foremost, that Antonia wasn't forthright and let's get this out. Come on, be honest.
Right.
So Maggie and Antonio go to the back room after the shift and they have a little come to Jesus meeting. And it doesn't go well because Maggie seems like she's accusing him of this tattoo, and he goes, he took it very personally because that tattoo was actually part of his sense of identity.
Mm.
And that very
Mm.
often happens for Gen Z. This
Sure.
piercing, this hair, whatever, it's all part of my identity. Maggie is very, very confounded by this. Come on, man. So Sam, they have 3 meetings and they still reach an impasse.
Mm.
Finally, in meeting number 4, I love how Maggie proceeded. She leaned in first, and then Antonio did. She said, Antonio, I got to be honest, I'm still not thrilled that you weren't candid about your tattoo when we talked about it at the interview. By the same token, she said, I love your work ethic, and everybody loves you here. You're so good with the customers. I don't want to lose you, and nobody else does either. So I'd like you and I to get in front of the entire team, and I want us both to apologize for what we need to apologize for.
Mm.
And then I want you to wear a long sleeve shirt underneath your uniform to show that you're willing to abide by this. Well, they did this, got a standing ovation, and Maggie kept a good team member, and yet she also didn't give in completely to, oh
Mm.
well, whatever, because everybody else would have gone, great, I'm getting a tattoo as well, baby. So, and you can't do that. Now, one more thing I'll say, Maggie had the wisdom to call corporate and say, could we rethink our policy on tattoos maybe? And I
Mm.
thought, this is great. She's a wonderful advocate of both sides, the mission and yet the team member. And that's where I think we need to go in the future.
Right. And what comes to mind for me
Okay.
is there may be so many people who have had these types of experiences that they get heated and
Yeah.
they go hot and
Yes.
maybe they blow up and they don't go like it went there,
Yeah.
and we get a sour taste in our mouth and we choose to just shut down this aspect of the
Yeah.
conversation.
Yeah.
That there may
Yeah.
be some generational differences here that could actually be really beneficial to develop some awareness and competency around,
Yeah. Yeah.
but instead we we get caught up in our, well, I'll say I grew up in Virginia near DC, but now I'm here in Northwest Arkansas where my wife grew up, and
Yep.
she counts herself as a true Southerner, where I
Yes.
grew up a little too close on the Mason-Dixon line to count
That's
as a
right.
true
That's right.
Southerner. But here in the South, when when we're writing someone off, we may
Yeah.
say, bless their heart. We
Yes.
may be
It's so
inclined to
true.
say, bless their heart.
Yeah.
And Gen Z, you're you're gonna figure it
Yeah.
out one way or the other,
Yes.
probably the
Yeah.
hard way.
Yep.
And I'll be there to tell you I told you so. And so we can get caught up in these attitudes of
Yeah.
judgment instead of being open and curious and end up advocating for each other. So
Yeah.
what do you think? How can we switch? How can we make that flip?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I want to reiterate something I mentioned earlier on the other podcast. When I surveyed representatives from all 5 of the generations that may still be at work today and are still at work today, I asked them, what do you look for in from other generations when you interact with them? I got a lot of responses that were different, but 3 came up in every single generation. Number 1, each one said, would you approach me with humility,
Mhm.
which communicates, I don't know everything. I'm willing to be teachable. Number 2, would you approach me with respect? Don't make me earn it on day 1. Begin with belief, not skepticism. And number 3, would you interact with me with curiosity? I love that word. So be
Mhm.
curious as to what might happen as we interact, even though we're 35 years apart. Can you imagine a workplace where everybody's interacting with humility, respect, and curiosity, old and
Mhm.
young? So that would be my first macro answer is
Mhm.
start practicing that one first, leaders who are listening. Or even if you're not a leader, say, I'm going to begin to do this with all generations, old and young, and see what will happen. I can almost promise you, you're going to get people as you lean in with those traits, they're going to lean in as well.
Mhm.
So I mentioned reverse mentoring. I
Right.
love that practice where old and young get together, but it's not just the old mentoring the young. That's natural. But halfway through the conversation, reverse mentoring says, you switch hats. And now you're saying, maybe as a 45 or 50-year-old to the 22-year-old, okay, download what you think I need to know. What's the
Right.
latest app you just bought? Or what's a platform you're on? Or where do you see society going right now? Where do you see the workplace changing? I'm telling you, they have intuition, younger people do, that I need. I don't have it anymore at my age. So,
Right.
yeah,
Right. And I think it's so important to note that we do each have something to teach each other
yeah, yeah,
and to learn. And I realized this only perhaps most readily this year when I've spent all my 20s and even younger pursuing mentorship relationships, wanting to, in some cases, like I want to catch their attention. I want to
yeah, yeah,
be in their head so that I can learn from them and they can be thinking about me. But
yeah,
then more recently, I've realized that, oh, I have something to give as well as a mentee or as a
yeah,
reverse mentor.
yeah,
And so I think for us younger people, I find it actually a very encouraging and empowering idea to think of myself as not just someone who's trying to leech off all of your
yeah.
wisdom, but as someone who can reciprocate.
No doubt about it. Can I share something that I put in one of the chapters, but it's so fascinating. If I can nutshell it, I can maybe whet the appetite of listeners. So Margaret Mead was arguably the most famous anthropologist of the 20th century. We quote her very often.
Mm,
She, in the 1970s, so this would have been 50 years ago, she came up with a way of thinking about human history. And she believed that human history is marked by three different eras. Okay.
okay.
Era number one, we have to go thousands of years back. Era number one, she called the post figurative era. And
Mm,
that means as young people grew up then, they figured out everything post the adults. In fact, the adults taught you everything. In
mm,
fact, growing up thousands of years ago, think about this, Sam. You were just to perpetuate the customs and traditions of past generations over and over and over and again. If you were a girl, you did what your mama did. If you're a boy, you did what your daddy did, even if your talent didn't lie there. Good luck,
mm,
Bob.
right.
And you just perpetuated the customs. And, that was it. When we moved into the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, so now hundreds of years ago, not thousands, we moved into what she called the co-figurative era
Mm,
because reason became king. We began to reason.
mm,
In fact, America was even born during this day. We hold these truths to be
self-evident.
self-evident. This is
Mm,
reasonable. Now the young and old figured out life together. So you had a say in who your marriage partner was for the very first time, and it
yeah.
wasn't arranged. That was
Right.
amazing.
Huh.
Here's what she said, and this is what you just said and didn't even know it. She said, I see a time because of the advancement of technology and media and everything else. We're going to be moving into the prefigurative era where the young will figure out things faster than the old, and
Mm,
we will need to be learning from them. Do you not see this today with smart technology? And you might
right.
not brag this about yourself, but I'm serious. Well, I'll give you an anecdotal illustration. If something goes wrong with my smartphone, you know who I give it to? My son, who's young. He's really young. He fixes it in 5 minutes. And
Mm,
I go, how did you know to do that? And he says, how did you not know? I mean, that's the conversations I have in my house. So
yeah.
I'm being goofy now, but I really believe leaders listening, we're moving into what Margaret Mead called the prefigurative era. You better have your listening hat on, not just your teaching hat. Both are going to be important.
Mm. I think it's interesting to note that again we may have these stereotypes
Yeah,
from perhaps lived experience and also a lot of media these days where
yeah,
as a younger person we may think, man, if my supervisor has to ask me to how to convert a PDF one more
yeah,
time, I'm just gonna leave. Or if my parents or my grandparents have
yeah,
to ask
yeah,
me how to change the
yeah.
HDMI cable on their TV,
Yes,
like I'm just gonna leave.
yes, yes.
But I wonder, there have been moments for me personally where I just take a pause
Yeah.
and choose gratitude. I
Hmm.
remember, who is this
Yeah.
person to me? And what have
Yeah.
they done for me? And is, is it
Yeah.
really such a bother to
Yeah.
have someone
Yeah.
who is probably never going to be as competent at you at a
That's right.
particular thing?
Yeah.
And you're
It's
going to
so
live with them, and you're going to live with
yeah.
that.
Yeah.
And I think approaching things with gratitude is just a happier way to live.
No, you're spot on. In fact, you're actually sharing research without even knowing it. It's
Mm,
so true. But you see what you have to do there, step back on the big picture. Who is this person to be? Oh my gosh, it's my grandmother or my dad or whatever. And you are grateful for all that they've done. And
mm,
they had to be patient back in the day when you were 7 years old or what, you know?
right.
So what goes around comes around. So you're absolutely right. My assistant Melissa is 18 years younger than me. So that's not
Mm,
enormous, but that's a generation.
yeah.
She's so understanding. And when I say, Melissa, thanks, I'm a dinosaur. I'm so sorry. She goes, Tim, you don't know that you taught me 7 things today already. I'm teaching you one thing. But I love that grateful spirit that comes from her because she sees the big picture, and I try to as well.
Yeah. Well, Tim, this is something I love to ask each and every one of my guests on this
Okay.
show. It being the Courage Coach for Executives podcast, I have to ask you, what does courage mean to you?
Wow. Well, this may sound cliche, but I think I decided a long time ago in my life when I've made courageous moves that it isn't the absence of fear. I think fear has
Mm,
is probably going to be there anytime I do something relatively new where there's some level of stakes in the game, but I believe it means I step forward instead of step back when I'm afraid, knowing that the cause or the reason for going forward is greater than my fear that makes me want to step backwards. So when I
mm,
started Growing Leaders, the nonprofit organization, which is all about developing the next generation of leaders,
mm,
it was scary. I was leaving John Maxwell, who gave me a
mm.
very secure job, a big paycheck. I was writing for him. It was amazing. But when I stepped out, I know I told my wife, honey, I hope we can put food on the table here. And we did. The good news is we did. In fact, John Maxwell has been supportive of me, wrote the first check to our nonprofit. It
Wow.
was just great. But, as an older guy helping a younger whippersnapper,
Mm,
get started. And now I'm reaching back myself. So let me share something that may be maybe the highlight of this conversation. In the New Kind of Diversity book, I put a very simple diagram toward the beginning of the book. And listeners, if you're having to imagine this, you can't see it. I want you to picture a circle or a cycle in your head. And up at the top of the circle, I want you to put the terms in your head tough times. Very
mm,
few people would disagree. We're in tough times. We're on the post pandemic era right now. We're still kind of getting back to normal. Some of us have had a tough economic time in our business, maybe tough family times with the masks and everything else, the
mm,
vaccines, the COVID thing. So we're in tough times. But think about history, Sam. Tough times generally build strong generations. You look at
mm,
the generation that fought World War II and lived through the Great Depression. They were a strong generation, resilient, gritty, resourceful. So tough times build strong generations. Strong generations usually build good times.
mm.
Unfortunately, good times often build weak generations, which in turn leads to tough times.
Right.
So all I'm saying now is if you're listening in and let's say you're in your 40s and you're kind of put off by these young whippersnappers joining the team, just know, treat this as a fitness center, an
Mm,
emotional, social, intellectual, work ethic fitness center, and say, hey, gang, we're going to be stronger for this in a decade. We'll be
mm.
lifting weights we would have never been able to lift, when it was easier, maybe 20 or 30 years ago. So I don't know if that sounds like I'm a chaplain right now, but I really believe we have to look at it this way, that this tough time could be a very big plus if we treat it like it was a weight room, it was a fitness center for us.
Mm,
And we believe that these young team members are going to be able to lift the weights even better because we empathized, because we listened, because we asked questions, not just barked out orders along the way.
yeah. Well, you're filling me up with some energy right now. And when the tough times come, the tough get going. Right.
Yeah,
That's
that's right.
let's be
Yeah.
proactive about
Yeah.
this. Let's not just sit on it, but let's make some differences in the people who are just around us. Let's just start there.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Wow.
absolutely. So agree.
Well, Tim, thank you so much for being on the show today.
It was my pleasure, Sam. Fun conversation. I hope it's helpful for your listeners.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so if you haven't already, please go back and listen to Paul's interview here with Tim. I had a great time there as well. But for now, I'm Sam, the Courage Coach for Executives. And remember, it starts with you.